All right, we are starting the life of Jacob this morning. We're having a test on in next class. That's Thursday, right? Thursday, the next class. So we'll have a test on the lives of Abraham and Isaac next class. Okay? Life of Jacob. The scriptures that give us Jacob's life extend from Genesis chapter 25 to 35. Jacob is one of the most significant Old Testament characters you'll run into. If Abraham represents God the Father, if Isaac represents God the Son, who do you think Jacob represents? Believers. Very good. Jacob is an example of a sinner, a believer who is a sinner, a fallible believer. And boy, is he ever fallible. Jacob is mentioned 27 times in the New Testament by his first name, Jacob. And 79 times, boy. 79 times by his second name, Israel. That's just in the New Testament. Jacob, 27. Jacob is mentioned in the genealogies. About 3 times in Matthew, chapter 1, verse 2. He is identified several times as one of the 3 patriarchs of Israel. For example, Matthew 8:11. Sometimes, very occasionally, Jacob's name stands for the nation Israel. Usually, however, his other name, Israel, represents the nation. But there are a couple of examples where Jacob represents the nation. Luke 1:33 is an example of that. Luke 1:33. What's that? Did you get that or what? Yeah, okay. There are, of course, several references to Jacob the individual. I'll give you those references. They're kind of important. John chapter 4, verses 5 and 6 and 12. Jesus was talking at the well with the Samaritan woman, and he was sitting beside whose well? Jacob's well. Okay? He was sitting beside Jacob's well. It was the well in Samaria that Jacob had dug centuries before. Acts chapter 7, verses 8 and 12 and 14 and 15. I'll read those references because they're a historical summary. Acts chapter 7. Verses 8 to 15. This is Stephen speaking before the Sanhedrin and summarizing the spiritual issues of Jewish history. God gave Abraham the covenant of circumcision, and so Abram begot Isaac, and circumcised him the 8th day, and Isaac begot Jacob, and Jacob begot the 12 patriarchs. The patriarchs, moved with envy, sold Joseph to Egypt, but God was with him, and delivered him out of all his afflictions, and gave him favor and wisdom in the sight of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he made him governor over Egypt and all his house. Now there came a famine over all the land of Egypt and Canaan, and great affliction, and our fathers found no sustenance. But when Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he sent out our fathers first. And at the second time Joseph was made known to his brethren, and Joseph's kindred was made known to Pharaoh. And then sent Joseph and called his father Jacob to him, and all his kindred, 75 souls. So Jacob went down into Egypt and died, he and our fathers, and were carried over into Shechem and laid in the sepulchre that Abram bought for a sum of money of the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem. Right? And then also in Romans chapter 9, verse 13, Jacob is mentioned as his children represent the sovereign election of God. Or as he himself, Isaac, one of Isaac's children. The children being not yet born, neither having done any good or evil, that the purpose of God according to election might stand, not of works, but of him that calleth. It was said unto her, the elder shall serve the younger, as it is written, Jacob have I loved, but Esau have I hated. And this is a direct reference back to Genesis 25, at the birth of Jacob and Esau. So Jacob is an outstanding example of the sovereignty of God in action on the positive side. And then Hebrews chapter 11, verses 9 and 20 and 21 indicates that he was a man of faith. By faith, Abraham journeyed in the land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed both the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning upon the top of his staff. And so, Jacob was a man of faith right at the end of his life. Some of the references to Jacob by his name of Israel obviously represents the people. Matthew 2:6. My people Israel. Occasionally it refers to the cities of the land. Matthew chapter 2, verse 20. 2:20. There are two instances where Israel refers to the spiritual descendants of Jacob. In Romans chapter 9, verse 6, spiritual descendants, right? Romans 9:6 refers to Jacob himself as a spiritual person whom God loved. And then there's one unique reference in Galatians 6:16, which is hotly debated between the all-mills and the pre-mills. Galatians 6:16. Paul concludes his book to these churches this way. He says, as many as walk according to this rule, peace be on them and mercy, and upon the Israel of God. Now, it relates to spiritual descendants of Jacob. Believers, in other words. Jacob himself was a believer, and also there are believers in every age. What is the meaning of this verse or the phrase in this verse where it says, upon the Israel of God. Premillennialists will take this verse and translate it this way: as many as walk according to this rule, peace be on them and mercy, also upon the Israel of God, referring to saved Jews. Paul is writing to believers, and he includes his blessing not just on Gentiles, but also upon saved Jews. Amils will interpret that phrase to equate believers with the nation Israel, making them one and the same, which is kind of a significant thing. They would interpret the verse this way: as many as walk according to this rule, peace be on them and mercy, even upon the Israel of God. They would make the word kai there, can be translated one or two different ways. And in this case, it makes a real difference. Is Israel equal to and synonymous with the church? Amils believe so. It's kind of an important thing. So that's an interpretive issue. But anyway, it illustrates that Jacob's descendants are spiritual people. By far and away, the most common reference to Israel in the New Testament refers to the nation, the tribes, children of Israel, house of Israel. 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50, 55, 60, 65. At least 68 times in the New Testament there are references to this. Philippians chapter 3, verse 5 refers to Israel. Paul's giving his testimony. He says, of the seed of Israel I was born, John 1:47. Matthew 8:10, etc. By the way, there is another Jacob mentioned in the Bible, and he's mentioned in the genealogy of Christ. Do you know who that was? Yeah, Jesus' grandfather by his step-grandfather. Okay? His name is Jacob. Matthew 1, 15 and 16. But don't get them confused. There's two Jacobs mentioned in the genealogy. So far we've been looking at the references to Jacob in the New Testament. We've seen that he goes by two names. These two names come out of the Old Testament. He was given his first name at birth, Jacob, Genesis 25:26. Yaakov is the Hebrew word. Yaakov. Genesis 25:26. And after that came his brother out, and his hand took hold on Esau's heel, and his name was called Jacob. The word Jacob comes from the verb akav, which means to follow at the heel. Figuratively, this verb means to assail insidiously, to overreach, to circumvent. It's a negative connotation with it. It's like going up behind a person and stabbing in the back. It's not very nice. And from his very birth, because he grabbed his brother's heel, he was named Jacob. And before he was born, the Lord had spoken to his mother Rebekah and said, 2 nations are in your womb, 2 manners of people shall be born of you, the one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger. There's going to be a unique relationship between these 2 boys that was out of the ordinary, and at his birth, it was even evidence. So they named him. So Jacob's name means supplanter. Supplanter. In essence, I suppose, to put it in a modern way, his name means that he attacked his brother at the heel. Israel, on the other hand, is a name that Jacob was given following the occasion when he fought with God during the night. He was on his way back from Syria after he had been gone for 20 years. And God appeared to him, and it says that he fought with him, and in the morning God touched the sinew of his hip or whatever, and he limped. That's Genesis 32:29. And Jacob asked him and said, "Tell me, I pray thee, thy name." And he said, "Wherefore is it that thou dost ask after my name?" And he blessed him there. Verse 27 and 28, God said unto him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." And he said, "Your name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel. For a prince hast thou power. For as a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and has prevailed." And Jacob spoke face to face with God. And so Israel means that God persists or preserves, or it can mean let God persist or contend. Let's look a little bit at the chronology in Jacob's life. These things are really interesting. I did a little extra work on Isaac the other night when I was preaching on an iron bridge, and boy, you can draw some very interesting things out about these people just based on the chronology. Like most of the time when you think of Isaac being offered up by his father Abraham, or attempted to be offered up, you usually think of a young boy, right? This was the movie's picture. The Jewish tradition says he was probably 25 at the time. You know, grown man. Most of the time when you picture Jacob and Esau fighting at home, or about, hating one another, and Jacob deceiving his father, you picture an adolescent kid or whatever, obeying what his mother says. But in reality, he was about 70 years old when he left home.
Yeah, that's good because their age is higher than ours.
Yeah, but still, even if you cut it in half, it's synonymous to a 35-year-old man doing what his mother says. He's a grown man. He was a mature person when he left home. It wasn't like a little kid running away from home to save his neck. Okay? So these dates that you're given in the Genesis chronology are rather significant to tell the story. Looking at the life of Jacob, he was born when his father was 60 years of age. And when his grandfather was 160. When Abraham died, Jacob was 15 years old. Yeah. When his brother Esau married, and his brother married before he did, he was 40, because his brother was 40 and they were twins. So He was 40 when his brother married. He was 63 years old when his uncle Ishmael died. It was sometime after this that he left home. We can't tell exactly, and he spent 20 years up in Syria. You recall that when he was up in Syria, he married who? Who did he marry? Not Rebecca, that was his mother. Rachel and Leah. Remember the deal that he made with his uncle up there? He said, I'll work 7 years for this good-looking daughter of yours. Right? And so the morning after, when he woke up, he saw that his uncle had tricked him and given him a less than beautiful one. And so he complained. He said, "You tricked me. The tables were turned this time." And poor old deceitful Jacob. And they that lived by the sword died by the sword. It's amazing how God works it out. And so he made another deal. He said, "Well, I'll work 7 more years for your other daughter." And so right off, he got two wives. One the next day. Probably Rachel was given to him the next day. And so he had to work 14 years for these 2 wives. And then later on it says that he worked 6 more years for the animals that became his wealth basis.
Then you gotta wait a week before you marry.
Well, whatever. But the point is that he had to work. He worked 20 years for his wives and his possessions. So 20 years of age by the time he decided, "Hey, I've had enough of this place. Let's get out of here." And during this time, remember, there were 11 sons born to him in Syria. Who was the last one born in Syria? Joseph. Because the youngest and last son of Jacob was born to Rachel, on which occasion she died, and they were coming back to Canaan on their way back to Hebron when that happened. She was journeying and she died in childbirth. And so, if he was 63 when Ishmael died and he left home about that time, he was 91 when Joseph was born, when his last child up in Syria was born. And 29 years later, after he had returned home and spent some time at home with his father, Isaac died. And so Jacob was 120 years old when his father, Isaac, died at 180 years himself.
These days, right?
Mm-hmm. Now, during this time, when Isaac died, Joseph had long gone from Jacob's home. He had been gone. Remember how many years Joseph spent in jail down in Egypt? Huh? I think it was 14.
Altogether.
Okay. Now he was in a couple of different jails, but if he was in jail for 14 years, and then he exalted. That means that for this 29 years between Joseph's birth and my goodness. They're hard to concentrate. They're fighting so bad down. Well, anyway, Jacob was 120 years when his father Isaac died. The next year, when he was 121, his son Joseph was exalted to the throne of Egypt. He was 121 when his son Joseph was installed on the throne of Egypt. There were 7 good years and 2 bad years, was it? So there was the passage of 9 years after Joseph was installed, which brings, and it was in that second year, it was in that last year of the famine that Jacob discovered that his son was in Egypt and went down to Egypt, and so that makes him 130 when he comes to Goshen in Egypt and stands before Pharaoh. He was 130 when he stood before Pharaoh. And Genesis chapter 47 verse 28 tells us that he died when he was 147 years of age, which means that he spent the last 17 years of his life living in the land of plenty, blessed, greatly blessed by God through his son Joseph in Egypt. He died in Egypt when he was 147, and there was a special trip made. Jacob's bones were taken up to Shechem in the land of Palestine. Joseph and his brothers went that long journey up there, and they buried him there, and he was laid to rest. Now, next class, I think we will pick up with the major events in Jacob's life and follow through his experiences and begin to draw some principles from that. I'd like to take some time on that because Jacob is such an important character. So I don't want to start today. We've got a few minutes left.